Video title: Disability Rights, Voting in Minnesota, created by Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid, Minnesota Disability Law Center. A timeline displays dates of historic events in voting history accompanied by black and white photographs. 1984. Polling places across the United States are required to be physically accessible to people with disabilities. A photo shows a person in a wheelchair waiting in line to vote. 1990. The nation's first comprehensive civil rights law addressing the needs of people with disabilities is passed. A photograph shows a man carrying a sign that says, "Achieve. I don't let my disability stop me." 1993. Congress enacts the National Voter Registration Act to enhance voting opportunities for every American. A photo of former President Bill Clinton signing a bill into law. 2002. The Help America Vote Act passed by Congress addresses improvements to voting systems and voter access. A photo shows people at voting booths. A large red and white "I voted" graphic appears on screen. From his office, Secretary of State Steve Simon speaks on camera.
I'm Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon, and as our state's Chief Elections Administrator, it's my office's responsibility to protect, defend, and strengthen the right to vote for all Minnesotans, and that includes people with disabilities. Voting is an important right in a democracy, and it's one important way for all people to make their voices heard. Regardless of your political viewpoint or what candidate or party you support, by voting, you have the power to effect change and to mold the future of your community, your state, and your country. Your vote is your voice, and you should never give that up.
Judy Sanders, advocate for the blind, is shown seated speaking to the camera.
I think that people with disabilities have an extreme responsibility to vote because it's one way that we can help get people into office who are going to pay attention to us. Nobody else is going to do it for us unless we do it ourselves. So we have an obligation to both inform elected officials or potential elected officials and then figure out which ones are most responsive to us.
Ashley Bailey, self-advocate, speaks.
I think voting is important because people with disabilities need to be able to know what they want and have the person elected that they feel will do the best to advocate for them.
A large red and white "Voting is Important" graphic appears on screen. Secretary of State Steve Simon on camera, supported with footage of a man assisting a woman entering a voting booth.
Voting is crucial in any democracy because our vote is our voice. It's the way that we hold our leaders accountable, and it's the way that we get things done and the outcomes that we want.
Jesselyn Eckerman Frank, President, Minnesota Association for Deaf Citizens, signs to the camera.
Voting rights are important for every person because they need to have their voices heard. Many decisions are made for individuals, and it's the most important right a person can have.
Noah McCourt, Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities member, speaks.
Like I said, we represent 19% of the American electorate. And when you include families, friends, teachers, and all these other individuals that really work in the lives of people with disabilities, you know, it's a really significant block and they deserve to be represented.
Judy Sanders, advocate for the blind, speaks.
And I'm proud to live in a state that has one of the highest voting percentages in the country.
A large red and white "Your Voting Rights" graphic appears on screen. Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon speaks.
Unfortunately, there have been barriers to voting in this state and in this country. And before the enactment of a 2002 law called the Help America Vote Act, there was no requirement that polling places actually had equipment and machinery to accommodate voters with disabilities. All that changed with the passage of that law.
A graphic appears on screen reading Help America Vote Act of 2002. Key disabled voter requirements: improve outdated voting systems, improve accessibility of polling places for disabled voters. State Steve Simon speaks.
And I'm proud and pleased to report that Minnesota has been leading the way since then in making sure that we have open, accessible polling places that provide a means for everyone who wishes to vote to vote.
A large red and white research graphic appears on screen. Krista Grossland, advocate for the disabled community, speaks.
It's important to me to know what candidates believe regarding disability supports in voting and in day-to-day life as well.
Supporting video of Krista in her power chair, moving to an accessible voting booth and filling out a ballot.
Kind of some of the things I look at is, what do these candidates believe about things that are going to impact my daily life? What do they believe about voter accessibility and the rights of everyone to vote? What do they believe about access to buildings on a daily basis? And what do they believe about health care? And any of the other issues that could impact my life daily.
Judy Sanders speaks.
So we have an obligation to both inform elected officials or potential elected officials and then figure out which ones are most responsive to us. I find the easiest way to do that is when we work together to do it, and it's why one of the things I take an active part in the National Federation of the Blind is contacting elected officials, and then I pay attention to who I vote for, and that's my most important issue.
A large red and white registering to vote graphic appears on screen. While Secretary Simon speaks, video plays of Krista entering a brick building and passing a sign that says Elections. She meets with an election official who provides voting registration instructions.
I think it's important that people realize that before you vote, you have to register to vote. Now, we're fortunate in Minnesota that we have a law called same-day or election day voter registration. So anyone in Minnesota can show up the day of the actual election and register, but you still do have to register. For those who choose to do it before election day, it's really never been easier to register than it is now. You don't have to put pen to paper unless you want to. You don't have to visit a government office unless you want to. You can now go to a website, mnvotes.org. That's mnvotes.org.
A screenshot of the mnvotes.org website is displayed.
And you can go and register online, which takes most people just a few minutes. These are just some of the ways in which Minnesota continues to open the doors wide to people not only to enter the polling place physically, but to participate in the democratic process. And it's a reason, I suspect, why Minnesota is either #1 year in and year out in voter turnout or very close to the top of the list.
A large red and white How to Vote graphic appears on screen. Physically accessible place. On-screen graphic of a handicap accessible sign. Help if needed. On-screen animation of a woman in a power chair getting voting assistance. Accessible voting machine. On-screen animation of a voting machine with the word vote. Curbside voting. On-screen animation of a car pulling up to a sign that says curbside voting only. Voting assistance in the booth. On-screen animation of a man in a wheelchair being assisted into a voting booth. Voting by mail. On-screen graphics of accessible voting options and the words "Get out the vote." Footage of Krista Grossland speaking with the election judge and getting her ballot. Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon speaks.
For voters with disabilities, there are a number of different options at the polling place. First, if there's some absence of accessibility or a problem in getting to vote, we really recommend that the person talk to an election official, an election judge in the polling place itself. A person with disabilities who's voting can bring someone with him or her into the polling place under state and federal law to assist that person in voting. And under federal law, there's a requirement that each and every polling place have assistive voting technology in place so that people with disabilities of all kinds can vote free from any interference.
Judy Sanders is assisted by the election judge in getting the voting machine set up. She then places her ballot in the counting machine. Judy Sanders speaks.
The first time I voted using one of the machines that has a headset, and so I can listen to what's on the ballot, and then there are buttons that I can push to cast my ballot. I was able to do this completely independently, and it was an awesome, kind of overwhelming feeling. And I've always voted that way ever since, and am now taking an active part in trying to see what the future holds for other voting machines.
Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon speaks.
In addition, Minnesota has what's commonly known as curbside voting, which means someone can show up outside the polling place, have an agent or a family member of some kind go inside and have the ballot brought out to the voters with disability in their vehicle. That's another way that state and federal law accommodate voters with disabilities.
A large red and white barriers to voting graphic appears on screen.
In my opinion,
Mai Thor, disability community advocate, speaks.
The whole election process doesn't address all of our needs. You know, we do have some really good laws that protect us and help us and encourage us to vote. But I think, you know, if you have a cognitive disability, it might be that you have difficulty reading and writing, and, you know, registering is so incumbent on those skills.
Judy Sanders speaks.
I took it for granted that I could always vote, but until 2006, I always had to vote with assistance because as a blind person, I'm not able to read the ballot, so it required another person to read it and mark it. I had to trust that they were doing what I said, and to my knowledge, that's not a problem, but I probably would never know if it was.
Noah McCourt speaks.
You know, do we have wheelchair ramps? Do we have different methods of opening doors? Do we have adaptive technology that can be understood by individuals with disabilities? And I think that those are going to be key issues in the future, and they've been key issues in the past.
Ashley Bailey speaks.
People with disabilities have issues voting because the polling places may not be accessible and they might not have the equipment accessible for people with disabilities to vote privately like the general public.
Jesselyn Ackerman Frank speaks.
Yes, they experience many barriers. For example, just having accessibility, getting into a polling place. Maybe the ballots are not in their language. Or the people at the polling place don't have practice communicating with disabled people. If a deaf person or a deaf-blind person comes in, then maybe they don't have an SSP, support service provider. So having access and just communicating in the polling place is difficult.
Noah McCourt speaks.
You know, there is a lot of stigma out there. There's a lot of different barriers that come from that stigma.
Justin Page, attorney at Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid, speaks.
We came across this election site where the voting took place on the second floor of a library. The problem was you had to take an elevator to get up to the second floor, and in a big sign on the elevator it said, "Elevator's locked during the day," and so it didn't work. And so an individual, if he or she tried to vote on that day at that precinct, would not have been able to do so.
A large red and white resolving problems graphic appears on screen. Ashley Bailey speaks.
I think that after you vote, you should talk to the person in charge at the polling place and tell them what went wrong. But also after you leave there, I think you should contact a county official to tell them about the experience you did have and what went wrong.
Justin Page speaks.
If something goes wrong during the voting process, I just advise that the voter try not to leave the voting area. Try to talk to the head election official there. If that doesn't work, potentially try to call the county or Minnesota Secretary of State's office and talk to someone there to try to resolve your issue. And if that doesn't all work, they can call our office, the Minnesota Disability Law Center, and we can try to resolve that issue.
Mai Thor speaks.
The fortunate thing about Minnesota is that we have a lot of really good election laws that help people in situations like that, where they can, ask for assistance or maybe bring someone along to help them when they're voting or whether they're registering to vote. In essence, the real challenge at the foundation of it is that, at some point we want to set up our system where anybody, no matter what your disability, could just do it.
Steve Simon speaks.
Well, we are very active on an ongoing basis in making sure that we help local election officials follow the law. That's federal law, that's state law, and these are the requirements that make sure that anyone in Minnesota, regardless of disability status, can vote. Part of that job is simply telling people, both the voting public and elections administrators, what the rules actually are. And it also means guiding voters with disabilities towards the ways that they can make things better.
A large red and white I voted graphic appears on screen. Mai Thor speaks.
Voting is just one of those fundamental rights, a basic right that any person has, any citizen has in this country, and should be able to exercise to their full extent.
Noah McCourt speaks.
We all have our different classes, our different races, but the one thing we all have is we all have one vote. And I think that counts a lot towards what we are as Americans and towards a society that is representative of the people.
Ashley Bailey speaks.
Voting rights are important to all people, and to ensure that we feel like we are getting the people who represent us the best.
Justin Page speaks.
People with disabilities should have their voices heard on a number of different issues that impact them, so it's very important to vote.
Judy Sanders speaks.
Voting is the key to our future.
Jesselyn Ackerman Frank speaks.
Voting rights are for everyone, including us.